Good afternoon to everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I want to talk to you today about working with higher order thinking skills. So in this session, we're going to be looking at ways of taking students beyond comprehension so that they start to work actively with the key concepts. We're going to look at ways of getting students engaged with the subject matter so that these mental cogs start turning and the learning experience becomes memorable and relevant to them. Now, before we get too deeply into this subject, I think we have to start by reflecting on the higher order thinking skills. What are these? Well, I'm sure as you all know, they come from what's called Bloom's taxonomy of thinking skills. And this was a taxonomy which was developed at the end of the 1940s and the 1950s, beginning of the 1950s, by a group of educators and psychologists. And it's been used by educators ever since to organize learning goals. And it looks at thinking skills in terms of the complexity of thought. It's generally presented as a pyramid. At the bottom of the pyramid, we have the lower order thinking skills, remembering, known knowledge, understanding and comprehending something new. And then we move on to doing something with the knowledge, to applying it, manipulating it, analyzing it, seeing patterns emerging, and then synthesizing and evaluating until finally we can do something with the new knowledge. We can take an action, we can create new ideas, link things together. And so this pyramid is what people talk about when they're talking about Bloom's taxonomy of thinking skills. But it's interesting to note that these thinking skills relate to one area or domain. They relate to the knowledge domain. This is how we think about knowledge. And Bloom and company developed other taxonomies about learning as well, which I think are interesting to consider. One of those is, they developed two. One is the affective domain. And this is about attitude towards learning, taking responsibility for learning, developing values, and a sense of responsibility. It's very much what was called, when I started working in the 1990s, actitudinales, which was always quite a hard word to say. And we receiving, being open to experience, open to new information, responding and participating, then valuing certain types of behavior, organizing our behavior and prioritizing choices, and then finally having a way of behaving that we are consistent and coherent with in our life. I think it's a very interesting domain, this as well, because we know how important the emotional aspect of learning is. Children need to have positive encouragement and support at all times, and they need to have a supportive learning environment, not a hostile one, where they feel encouraged, nurtured, and they can develop. So this is an interesting area as well to be considering. The last area that they dealt with was about the psychomotor domain, which is about movement, learning about movement and thoughts about movement. And Bloom didn't develop this into a taxonomy. It was developed later, and the first two levels of this pyramid are quite similar to the affective domain, about being ready to act, being responsive. But the other five sets of levels, I think we can all recognize if we relate them to, say, learning how to drive a car. And first we imitate the movements in a guided response until we become basically proficient users of a car. We can drive, change gear, maneuver. An expert user would be able to do more complex tasks like parallel parking and things like that. Adaptation is where you are thrown into a new situation and you can adapt the movements to cope with it, like skidding on some black ice or something like that. And finally, you would be getting to creation, where you can develop a new set of movements to apply to a similar but different situation, like in this example, using another machine with an engine. This is also very interesting for the classroom, because we know how much children move in the classroom. We often use TPR as a way of linking movement to knowledge. And so I think these three domains work very much together. However, the focus has always been on the knowledge domain. And when people talk about HOTS and LOTS, they are generally referring to this pyramid, the pyramid that relates to the thinking skills that are applied to knowledge. And that brings us to the next question. What do we mean by knowledge? There are lots of different types of knowing. Quite often we divide knowledge into two big groups. We can talk about factual knowledge, knowing what. Some of the activities that would be related to this might be, for example, what are the 5 groups of living organisms? You need to know those 5 names. Give examples of living species from each group. You need to have facts to be able to carry out this task. This is from the natural science curriculum of segundo, I think, or tercero. And here's another one, which is make lists of countries in the Spanish Empire. We're in the social science curriculum now. You can't make a list of all the countries in the Spanish Empire in the 1600s because it would be a little bit too long. But we're talking about facts here, coming up with at least one country from each of those continents that were part of the Spanish Empire. Fact base. Here's an easier fact-based activity for the younger children. Tick the 3 things that all living things need: food, mountains, water, oxygen. And this is based on your factual knowledge of life. So this is know what. But we also have know how. And this is about skills, knowing how to do things. These are the type of activities you might have related to know how. This one is from natural science again. Choose a question and ask 4 friends. What did you have for breakfast this morning? How many hours did you sleep last night? And analyze the results as healthy or not healthy. And so here we're asking the children to do something with their knowledge. We're asking them to devise a survey, to find some way of graphically presenting the results as well. This requires skills knowledge. Here's another skills knowledge activity. I think it's easier than the one before. Make a list of 10 machines in your house and write them into 2 lists, classified. It works with human force or it works with electricity. And so here, children have to know about this difference. They have to be able to apply a classification method. And finally, there's some questions. Knowing how to answer questions. Why do rivers carry more water at the mouth than the source? Why do you think a river moves faster in the upper course? Here we're asking them to analyze the information they have been given to be able to answer a deeper question about how the water works, the volume of water in the river, which won't be explicit in the information, it will be implicit. And so they have to show their skills, analytical skills, literacy skills here. So these are know-how. But I think you can see from these examples that they're never completely separated. In the know what activities, we had some classification. And in the know-how activities, we are relying on knowledge as well, because these 2 areas of knowledge are linked. Now, how do they map onto our pyramid of the Bloom's taxonomy? Well, the lower stages, which we identified as the lower order thinking skills, are really about factual knowledge. Whereas the higher levels, which we identified as the higher order thinking skills, are more about skills knowledge, know-how. And so this pyramid doesn't really reflect the interlinking nature of these 2 types of knowledge, that they're not separated from each other in this simple way. And how does this relate to the learning process? Well, normally it seems obvious that we start at the bottom stand of the learning process and we move our way up. We get a new piece of knowledge and we remember it and we struggle to understand it, and then we work on applying it in some circumstance. We analyze it to see patterns of behavior emerging, patterns of thought. We evaluate it and synthesize the knowledge into a mind map. And finally, yes, we're at the top and we can do something with our new knowledge and communicate an original thought. And it's very linear and progressive. However, I'm not sure if this is really how learning works, because when we introduce a new idea, it doesn't fall into a vacuum. It becomes incorporated into an existing knowledge system because knowledge is linked. And I think it might be more useful to think of these different thinking sets, these thinking skills, as working together in a spiral. And once we introduce a new idea or a new fact, it immediately starts spiraling out. We start analysing it and applying it almost subconsciously with the body of knowledge and understanding of the world that we already have. Let me give you just a little example of that. A sentence from a book, which I'll read to you now. When Mary heard the ice cream van, she ran upstairs for her pocket money. It's just one sentence, but from that one piece of information, we're going to build up a huge picture about how old Mary is, what type of house she lives in, what country she lives in, maybe, the social, the cultural context. And we may also start to perhaps evaluate her behaviour. Is it right that a child should rush off on her own to buy an ice cream without checking with her parents or other carers? So we can see how these thinking skills, when we're given some new information, we are automatically analysing it and evaluating it. So I think we need to incorporate these new themes in higher order thinking skills right from the beginning. We don't need to see them as so separate. I'd like to take a bit of a break now. I think you might have been sending in some questions. Give me a chance to answer some of them. And here are some questions of mine for you to think of. Is the age of the child important when we think about the balance between higher and lower order thinking skills? And a very difficult question. How do these thinking skills develop? Let me see if I have any questions here. No? No questions yet? Okay, well, I'll talk a bit about the first question I've posed there for you, about the age of the child. And obviously, the cognitive development is a very significant factor when you're teaching at primary. But I think we often underestimate what children can do, or perhaps misinterpret what they're telling us. This is an anecdote I'd like to give you. I'm just going to remind you to use the question box if you want to send any questions. And I'll go with my anecdote. I asked a 7-year-old, I was talking about a family to a 5-year-old child made up of a mother and father, 2 children, both boys, and a dog, a female dog. And I asked the child, I can't remember why, who the odd one out in the family was. And she said, oh, it's the dog, very confidently. And so I asked, well, why is the dog the odd one out? And she thought for a bit and she looked up at me and she said, oh, because she's a girl. And that really surprised me because obviously the mother is a woman, a female as well. And I thought, oh, well, she's probably too young to really understand about categorizing. And maybe she's only recognized gender as the only category that she's recognizing. And I reflected on this later and I thought, well, probably she does know different ways of saying why the dog is different, that it has 4 legs, that it's covered in hair, that wags its tail. But maybe she just thought that this was the most interesting difference. So quite often with children, we have to be very careful how we're interpreting what they're saying to us. Okay, and if we don't have any questions, I think I'll go on then. Okay, let me continue with the next section of my talk. Okay, now we want to think about how the higher order thinking skills can fit into a process of learning when you're starting a new topic of work. The initial point of a new topic of work is a really very obvious point to be starting with higher order thinking skills, because what we need to do when we start a new topic is pull to the forefront of the mind everything that they know that's relevant to the topic. What do you already know? And it can be very useful to start this with HOTS, going straight in to talking about their experience of the world. I'd like to start by giving an example from mass and volume. Just let me go to the next slide. Okay, we can start this topic of mass and volume by bringing in lots of balls of different sizes and just asking the children. They know about size, they know about weight, to start talking about which one is bigger, which one do they think is heavier. And we can lead them to coming to this very important idea that mass and volume are not the same, that 2 things of the same size can weigh something very different. So we can lead them straight into the new topic through higher order thinking skills, through experimentation and observation. And this works as well for volume. We can do an experiment with 2 containers of different shapes, and we can ask which container can hold the biggest amount of water. And children will tend to go for the long, thin container, not the small, squat one. But we can test their ideas immediately, pouring water in from container to container. And we can start in this way directly with higher order thinking skills. It's perhaps easy when it's a natural science topic, which we can touch and feel. But we can also do this with more abstract social science topics. And as children get older, you have more information that you can use to initiate a new topic. If we look at a topic from the social science curriculum from quinto or sexto of migration and demography, there's some very, very complicated words in this topic, like rural migration, natural population growth, real population growth, immigration. And these are very difficult when we're working in two languages. But before we get bogged down with terminology, we can go introduce the topic with a higher order thinking skill activity by doing a class survey. We can ask the students, how many of you were born in this country, or in this comunidad autónoma, or in this locality, the city or a town? Or we can extend that to parents and grandparents, and we can start to represent this information graphically, maybe with a map, putting a pin in all the different places that people have come from. We could do a bar chart looking at the numbers of people who were born in different places. Before we start introducing new complicated ideas, we can start with a hands-on HOTS activity that gets the students involved and gets those cogs turning. So I think starting a new topic is an area where HOTS activities fit in very easily. The type of HOTS activities that are appropriate will depend on the subject matter. And this is another way of thinking about thinking, is that each subject area requires different thinking skills. And I'd like you just to hold that idea in your head for a bit while we work through the next activities. I've tried to give a good balance of subject areas so that we can see different thinking skills. But you have to think like a historian when you're working in history, and you have to think like a scientist when you're working with science, and these are different thinking skills. Let's go on to looking at how we can present new information, working with all the thinking skills and sets and spiraling around so that we work quickly into the HOTS, the higher order thinking. Now, there are different things that you have to bear in mind when you're presenting new information. And I think probably the most important one is, what are your learning objectives? The learning objectives need to be firmly aimed at the higher order thinking skills. Let me give you an example of what I mean. When we're teaching a topic of work about muscles, for example, lots of very complicated words there. And if our learning objective is to be able to name the muscles of the human body, that's a lower order learning skill. Depending on how many of those muscles we ask them to name, this could take an awfully long time. A lot of effort will go into learning these things, and they can be forgotten very, very quickly. This is the typical CODOS activity, which you've revised before an exam. You get down on the paper for an exam and then you forget immediately. Very typical of the lower order thinking skills. But if our learning objective is to learn about the pairs of muscles, understand how pairs of muscles work together to move the joints and the bones in the human body, if this is our learning objective, we can go very quickly on to hands-on HOTS activities. We can ask the children to find pairs of muscles on their body, to experiment, finding which muscle has to contract to bend the elbow. And we're moving them directly into the area of higher order thinking skills, of experimentation and hands-on activity. So the learning objectives are very important. I'm now going to talk about two things that you shouldn't do, two negatives. And I'm going to start off with the one that for me is the absolute kiss of death for learning, a big no-no as far as I'm concerned. Please don't start with definitions. Definitions are very difficult to understand without context, without anything around them. I call them dreadful definitions. And here are some for you to start looking at. How about this one? All matter has mass and volume. There are only 6 words in that sentence, and only 3 of them are about content, but it's extremely difficult to understand. It's much easier to arrive at this definition through experimentation with weighing and measuring, as we've seen earlier. Not a good place to start a definition like that. Here's another definition, which is one of my most hated ones. Sound energy is produced by the vibration of sound waves. This is very complex language in here. Remember, in the bilingual classroom, language can be a real barrier to comprehension. And here we're talking about sound, and suddenly we have a word vibration, which is about feeling. And then we're talking about waves, which is normally something that we perceive through the eyes. We see waves on the beach when the tide comes in. It's a very difficult sentence, this. And yet, if we approach this from the discovery side, where we can see, maybe put peas on a drum and watch them jumping up and down with the vibration of the sound, make a sound box and twang the elastic bands and see how it vibrates and the sound is produced, we finally arrive at this definition. We don't start here. Here's another definition which always throws the children. A magnet has a north and a south pole. And they go, but North Pole, isn't that where the polar bears live? And you've thrown them completely. It's much easier to just explore magnets through doing activities with them and then reaching this definition. And the last one I've chosen for you isn't really a definition, it's more of a fact. You also have to be very careful about facts because they do change. And here's one which I hope will make you all laugh. The European Union is made up of 28 countries. I don't know if this makes me laugh or cry because obviously this fact may well be different by next week when the European Union might only have 27 countries. What I'm trying to say is that these bald statements, definitions and facts are not the best way to introduce higher order thinking skills. They're not the best way to get the mental cogs working when we present new information. They're dreadful. My other negative is about quantity of information. Don't present all the new information at once. I call this front loading. Don't front load the information. It needs to be broken up into chunks that students can manage and deal with. And you need to break it up with questions. Keep stopping and asking leading questions. If we take, for example, the topic of the Neolithic age, the interesting thing about the Neolithic age is that it's marked by humans looking after animals and growing crops, the start of farming. And we can give them this information and then immediately start asking questions. How did life change because of farming? How did people's lives change? It's a shame that most kids find history really boring when it's about people's lives. And I think this is a lot to do with the way we teach it. It's an interesting approach for history is to find out what the children would like to know about life at that time. Not just what we think is important for them to know, but ask them, what would you like to know about this? What would you like to know about how people lived during the Neolithic age? And you'll come up with some very interesting questions to explore. And by asking them to formulate the questions, they're moving into higher order thinking skills. You might get some silly questions, and children can quite often get scatological and ask about toilet arrangements and things like that, but it doesn't matter. This is what brings history alive, is empathizing and realizing that history is about people living a long time ago, but people. Here's another question that you could follow up from here. What tools did people use in the Neolithic age? History needs a lot of visual background, and this would be meaningless without giving some images and talking about these different tools and what they were used for and what they were made of. And once we've presented some new information, we want to throw it back at them and get them to start really chewing this information over and producing more questions and answering questions. What other objects can be made from clay or mud? What do you think people made from clay or mud in the Neolithic age? Bricks, houses, plates. What tools are useful for making food? do the mill to grind the grain down and make flour, a pot for transferring liquids. And all this helps children to imagine life in the Neolithic age, gets the cogs turning and the higher order thinking skills being activated. So leading questions are very important. And my last point about presenting new information is something that I keep coming back to. I'm spiraling back to it. As my mother says, cada loco con su tema. Hands-on explanations. We really need to get physical in the class. We need to start doing things. We saw this with mass and volume, that the best way to approach such an abstract subject was through looking at things, weighing them and feeling them. And this is true for lots of different subjects. The magnet's definition, which was so strange for a young child, can easily be explained by showing them a magnetic field. It's not complicated to do this in the classroom. You need a bar magnet, a piece of paper which is supported, and some iron filings. And when you scatter them on the piece of paper, they will arrange themselves in the pattern of a magnetic field. And you can start to explain it from there. And then once you introduce another magnet into the experiment, you can start showing how the opposite poles of a magnet will attract the filings, and the same poles will repel them and send them away. And they can see this happening. And then when you start talking about the north and south pole of a magnet, it makes sense to them. Hands-on explanations. Now, so far, all the hands-on explanations that I've talked about have been very much teacher-led. But there's a whole very rich area to work with in the classroom, which is child-led discovery, where children experiment and come up with the conclusions themselves. We obviously guide them by setting up the experiments, providing them with the material, posing questions. But it's very exciting to see children discovering things on their own rather than just being told them. The most famous example of this is perhaps with the Cuisenaire rods, which have been used for decades now to teach children about numbers, the relationships between numbers. And they're still used in classrooms today, commonly in primero and segundo de primaria. And through them, children can experiment and find out the number bonds, multiplication, ratios, how the numbers relate to each other. And they can discover this on their own. And we can do this with lots of different areas. For example, if we're studying the property of matters, we bring in real objects to the class. Maybe a nail might not be the right metal object to bring in, but you get the idea. Bring in a range of different objects and let the children feel them and talk about them. Can I bend it? Can I tear it? Can I see through it? Is it transparent? Can I break it? Is it brittle? And we can lead them to build up an idea of the materials have different properties. Here's another example, is what happens when water freezes. I never understand why we tell them this, when it's such an easy and fun thing to discover. You can give them a bottle of water and ask them to half fill it up and to draw a mark. And then they can go off to the kitchens at school and put them in the freezer. And at the end of the day, come back, or the next day, and see where on the bottle the frozen water has reached to, and realize through their own discovery that the anomalous dilation of water and that it will occupy more space when it's frozen. And this is hands-on student discovery. And perhaps one of the most famous examples of this is the marshmallow experiment, where you give students a whole lot of spaghetti and a bag of marshmallows, and you ask them to build a bridge or any other solid structure. But a bridge is a good structure to build because we can understand the purpose of it. And there'll be a lot of mess, and there'll be an awful lot of trial and error, and the bridge will collapse. But finally, they will work out a structure that is solid enough so that they can make a bridge. They'll work out that the triangles, they make a shape with triangles, it will support much better than a rectangle. And on their own, they will find out how to build a bridge. It's a very exciting thing to watch as a teacher, the trial and error as students work out how they can do something on their own. I think I might take another break now and see if you have any questions that you'd like to ask me. I've got some questions for you to think about. Do the subject areas develop the same thinking skills? And what is the balance of HOTS and LOTS? And here's a challenge for you for the end of the session. How many ways can you think of to use Cuisenaire rods? Okay, don't forget to use your question box if you want to send me any questions. Do you have any explanations for the answer? Ana Maria, I'm not sure the answer to which question. My biggest difficulty is, maybe I'm not, is sometimes to understand the child's thinking. Yes, understanding the child's thinking is really, really very difficult and complex and important, especially for the lower levels of primary, maybe for the secondary as well. We have to try and understand adolescent thinking. How can we do this? Studying empathy. Sometimes you have to try and put yourself into the child's situation and try and imagine what it's like with that. I spend quite a lot of time doing this in my private life because I have a nephew with Down syndrome, and he sometimes says things that seem completely ridiculous. But I've learned through experience that he never says something that's ridiculous. He's just phrasing the questions in a different way, explaining his reality in a different way. And one of the jobs as educators is to try and decode their reality and get to get into their shoes, into their heads. I hope that helps, Ana Maria. Let me see, what's the next question? It's you again. Hands-on explanation only works with practical areas, not in an English class, right? Well, it's interesting you should say that. Helena, I think that's Helena who's asked me that question. This session is aimed at the bilingual CLIL classes mainly, and I am directing myself to the curriculum for natural and social science. And so I'm very concerned in this session that we should transmit clear conceptual ideas that are related to the natural science curriculum and the social science curriculum. And that's really the focus rather than perfecting English language skills. However, you definitely need HOTS activities in the English language classroom. And in the English language classroom, we are often dealing with practical areas. We have to talk about something. We often talk about areas from the curriculum that could be developed further in the English language classroom and which we can use hands-on practical explanations for. It depends on our topic, whether a hands-on discovery type approach is going to be suitable. If our topic is the Spanish War of Independence, hands-on discovery is going to be more difficult. If what we want to transmit is how to use the present perfect, again, we're going to have to think of some different way. So it's not always the right way to approach a new body of knowledge. Grammar, how should it be presented? Well, I think that grammar needs to be dealt with as an inductive grammar approach rather than a deductive grammar approach. And this is very similar to what I was saying about definitions. We need to guide the children to the rules rather than giving them the rules and telling them to apply them. So with grammar, say, for example, if, as I mentioned, the present perfect is a difficult structure to teach, the best way to teach it is to think of a situation when you'd use it. For example, have you ever seen a film about a flying donkey? Or have you ever been to the United States? Have you ever questions? Within a topic, a limited topic like films, have you ever seen this film or that film? Get them to use the structure in a meaningful way before you analyze the grammatical components of that structure and the parts of speech. Similar, I think, to what I was saying about definitions, especially with young learners, they need to use the language before they analyze it. So we want a deductive approach to grammar. This isn't true of all learners, but I think it is true of all young learners. What about writing and reading specific exercises? Writing and reading are different forms of communication, and I think sometimes we think that they're sort of like the later stage. We do speak before we write, and it's very important to articulate ideas before we set them down on paper, especially for young learners. But they are also tools for communication, and there are lots of activities, whether they're in the English language classroom or in the bilingual CLIL classroom, where we are going to be communicating ideas not just through speech, but also through writing. We're going to be learning through reading. Literacy, how to deep reading comprehension. When I say literacy, I mean a deep understanding of a text, is a essential skill for the social science topics. And so there will be a lot of reading tasks in the social science topics. And it would be important for teachers to be examining literacy ideas about implicit meaning in texts, explicit meaning, so that when students read a new piece of text, they are doing a deep reading of it. And writing activities, well, a lot of the way you can demonstrate what you know is by writing in some sort of activity. Again, social science, a lot more writing than with natural science, but timelines, a description of somebody's life, empathy activities in history are great for writing. The diary of a child traveling on the Mayflower. There are lots of types of writing where you can get the thinking skills going. I can talk an awful lot about reading and writing. Is there any more questions? Answers given by the child when she talked about the dog. I'm glad you are. Do you want me to repeat the answers? That she said that the dog was different because she was a girl. And so she focused on gender difference. And I thought maybe that was because she only understood gender difference. But on further reflection, I think she did understand other differences and that she thought that this was maybe what I was asking her. And children frequently try to work out what's the adult asking me. They don't necessarily get it immediately. And as children get older, they become much more acute and quick at saying, oh, right, the adult's asking me this because they want me to reply with this sort of answer. It's part of the give and take of communication. And coming back to my nephew, it's one of the things that he struggles with, particularly in education. He can't see why he's being asked to do a reading test. He can't see the point of testing. So he always fails. Something worth thinking about, I think. Okay, I don't think we've got any more questions now. So I'm going to go on to the last part of my talk, where I'm going to talk about student outcomes. Now, this is at the end of the learning process, we get onto student outcomes. And at this stage, we should certainly be working with higher order thinking skills. We're going to, at the end of this body of work, when we're working with the topic, we want the students to be linking this new knowledge to existing knowledge in a very explicit way. And we're going to want them to use their new knowledge and their existing knowledge to do something, to produce something. And we're going to want them to pose and answer questions about the new content. I think it's very important that they should do something with this new knowledge. I often reflect, if we ask them to learn the names of all the rivers in Spain, my question is, why are they learning that? What's it for? We can think of things that they can do with it, but we must have an answer to that question. What is this new knowledge for? What are the children going to use it for? So what sort of student outcomes are relevant to the higher order learning skills? I think it's also very interesting with children, if you ask them at the end of the day, what have you learned? They can normally find it very hard to answer that question. But if you ask them, what have you done today? It's a question that they're much more liable to be able to answer, because if they've done something, So we want a student outcome to be something they can talk about later. And as they talk, they can be articulating their new knowledge. So particularly good student outcomes are something tangible that they've made and that they can touch. If we come to the example we had of the pairs of muscles, we can ask students, a student outcome could be to make a model joint. Making activities in the classroom obviously depend on the materials that you have access to and whether parents cooperate and whether the children come to class with the right sorts of materials. And you want to keep it simple. A model joint is very, very easy to make. You need strips of paper, a butterfly clip, and some elastic bands. I'm not sure if you can see in the picture I've given you there, but these are materials that are readily available at school. I don't think you even need to make a special effort to get hold of these. And the students can make the muscle and demonstrate what happens when a muscle contracts and how the joint, which is the butterfly clip, makes the bone, which is the strip of paper, move. And this can then be taken home. It can be shown, what have you done today? I made a joint and this is how it works. They can articulate what they've learned if they make something. That's a very easy thing to make. This would be a more complex thing to make, a model of a Neolithic village. It's more of a project which you would do over time, where you slowly choose an area, build a landscape with a bit of mountain area and a river, and you'd start building walls around the area that you've decided to be the village and making huts. You'd need to have shown children models, maybe looked at some archaeological digs, and then as you go on learning more about Neolithic life, you can start making human forms representing some of the activities that people would be carrying out then. It's an interesting activity, this, as you go through all of prehistory and ancient history, because you can start adapting this Neolithic village, and as you come on to the Paleolithic period, you can start changing aspects of it, adapting the buildings and the activities, and as you move through into the ancient history period, you can adapt it into a Phoenician city maybe, leaving perhaps a remain from the Neolithic times behind, and you can slowly look at how a settlement changes over time and is slowly built up around a concrete geographical area. So these are both student outcomes that can be made and talked about. And I think that's a very important thing to do at the end of a body of work. Now, when we're talking about the bilingual classroom, student outcomes mean English. And if you think about the hexagon I gave you with the different thinking skills and the swirly spiral in the middle, we could ask ourselves, what language is all that swirly, spirally stuff happening in? Is it happening in English? Is it happening in L1 in Spanish? Probably it's happening in a mixture. Probably most of the higher order thinking skill activities are happening in L1 at the initial stages. And we need to support the language on the understanding that this is a bilingual class, that two languages exist in this class. All the input needs to be given in English. The text input, the input that you're giving, all that input is given in English. But the output, what the students produce, will be a mix. This is very natural in a bilingual situation. Children who grow up bilingually mix the languages all the way through their life, initially because that's the way they think, and later through choice because they like the way something sounds in one language or another, and they'll very fluently switch code. It's a part of the process of bilingualism, is the mixing of the language. And I like the way this is reflected in a lot of the teaching materials, where the place names are given in Spanish. We talk about the Picos de Europa in the middle of an English sentence. It sounds very strange to me to talk about the European peaks or peaks of Europe or something like that. We also tend to use proper names in Spanish as well. We'll talk about Felipe II in the middle of a sentence in English. And I think this is absolutely fine and correct in a bilingual context. So the languages will be mixed and the output will come in both languages. But we do need to be very reactive to the language that the students want. And if they're going to do a class presentation, we need to make sure that they do have that language, and they'll be asking you for words. You need to produce those words when you're asked. What if they ask for a word that I don't really know? That's fine. Dictionaries, part of the language learning process is knowing how to find unknown words, and it's a very useful process for them to see you, the teacher, looking up a word. What tools do you use? How do you solve that problem? So the process of finding new words, giving new words in English is an absolutely key and important standard part of the bilingual classroom. And often we can use model sentences, structures, where students can replace part of the words with their own. Typical final student outcome at the end of a class might be to have a class quiz about what you've learned, where students play 20 questions or do true and false sentences for each other. And we can give them the language model there so that they can substitute and put in their own ideas. This is a 20 questions about properties of material, where you're guessing a material or an object. First, the colour. What colour is it? And then you go through asking questions about the different properties. And we give the model the cascading questions here, and students can apply them to play the game. So we're supporting the language output with these models, on the understanding that they might slip and go into Spanish sometimes. So that's the language problem in a student outcome, to be supportive and understand that the two languages will be working together. I'd like to talk a little bit about assessment as well, because this is at the end of a body of work. We need to assess it. And here I come back to the learning objectives. We have to assess according to the learning objectives that we've established at the beginning of the learning process. There's a very famous effect called the washback effect, which means that students tend to focus all their learning effort on what's needed to be successful at assessment. Most students will do this. And so if they are going to be assessed on the names of the muscles and they're going to label a diagram, that's where their learning effort is going to go into. But if your learning objectives are higher order thinking skills, like the pairs of muscles, how do pairs of muscles work together, this needs to be reflected in the assessment, maybe with a series of diagrams where students colour the contracted muscle. So it's very important that the higher order thinking skills that you've established for your learning objectives are reflected in the assessment. So these HOTS activities, here's an example from social science. History, social science, is really easy to slip into the lower order thinking skills assessments because there's so many facts, and you could get them to match facts to events, or give the dates of the kings and queens, or organize events in chronological order. And actually, I think that reduces what history is to making it a series of events about famous people and occasions, and it's not that really. It's about a story of change that has an impact on people's lives. A more interesting way to assess history, and this is at the end of a unit of work on the fall of the Roman Empire. Why did the Roman Empire fall? Don't get them just to give you dates of the events that led to its fall, but get them to analyze the causes, things that were internal to the Roman Empire and things that the Germanic tribes were causing. So they can analyze and classify these statements and then organize them in some sort of chronological order, so that at the end they have a mind map which shows cause and effect as well as just chronology. So assessments, HOTS activities for assessments, please. I'm going to finish off now by just making so few conclusions. HOTS at all stages. These learning skills work together in a spiral, and when we're getting those cogs turning, all of the thinking skills will be coming into play depending on what we're getting them to think about. So we want active learners using HOTS to carry out a task, to answer why and how questions, to experiment, to discover things. I'm just going to finish now with a quotation which I'm sure many of you are very familiar with, from Benjamin Franklin. Tell me and I forget, teach me and I remember, and involve me and I learn in a deep and meaningful way. Okay, well, I've come to the end of my session now. I've given you, I think I've got a bit of time. If you'd like to ask me some questions, let's see if there are any. And don't forget the Cuisenaire challenge. How many ways can you use Cuisenaire rods in the classroom? Here's a question. Let me see. Which are the best methods or ways to teach, for example, a natural science subject? Some contents are more complex than others. Indeed, they are. Abstract concepts are the most difficult. When natural science, you want to try to relate it to the natural world so that we move towards abstract from the real and the concrete. I've given you a few examples today, like the magnets. North and South Pole are very abstract, but you can make them real by looking at them. I'm trying to think of an example of a really complex natural science subject that we could examine now, and my mind's gone blank on them. If you could give me an example of a subject that you find particularly abstract and difficult, it would help me, because I'm thinking at the moment of ones where you can really start looking, okay, how about the movement of the plates of the earth and the geology? That's difficult, isn't it? Because you can't see it. But there's some very interesting computer programs to demonstrate how that works. And you could try to make it real by running videos so that they could see movements of the tectonic plates. Okay, I think I've got another one. The different subject areas require different thinking skills. touched on this earlier. I mean, if you're studying history, there will be lots of facts which will keep you perhaps in the remembering, recalling area of the thinking skills for longer, although you will need to move on to the HOTS early. If you're doing maths, you might quickly be applying. I often remember the different ways my brother and I, who's a mathematician, revised. I'd be walking up and down the corridor trying to remember my history, writing mind maps, writing essays about, why did the Roman Empire fall? And he'd be working through exercises, practice, practice, practice. So I think it's very true that the different subject areas require different thinking skills. Would you mind to clear me up a bit between the difference between HOTS and LOTS? Great. Let's go back to the pyramid I had right at the beginning, because I think we can look at this graphically. It's probably the easiest way to look at it. All the way back through my pieces of paper. And we'll get back to, I did give you a lot of pictures today, didn't I? Okay, all the way back. No, I've used not the spiral, the first pyramid. Oh, we can have this pyramid. This pyramid will work very nicely. Okay, this is the pyramid that's generally used to explain the taxonomy of learning skills. And we start here. The lower order learning skills are generally considered to be these two at the bottom. Remembering things that you already know, facts about the world, understanding them in a fairly basic way, being able to discuss them and summarize them. We move up into what are called the higher order thinking skills when we start applying the knowledge, manipulating it, maybe using it in a different context. We start analyzing the knowledge, categorizing it, seeing patterns emerge. We can start evaluating it, synthesizing it, making it into a mind map, drawing it out graphically, until finally we can take action and do something with the new knowledge, make and create. And the interesting things about these is that at each level, they become both more complex and more specific to a type of task. And sometimes these four levels are these three levels are presented equally, because really they're about different types of tasks. And sometimes you evaluate and create at the same time. But the most common way of seeing the taxonomy is to see it presented as a pyramid. It has been questioned whether it is a true taxonomy, but I think we can deal with the graphic that everybody's used to, which is this taxonomy of different levels of thinking. Thank you. Ooh, flipped classroom. That's so interesting. Wasn't there a question there about the flipped classroom that we've missed? That one. New ways to teach. Thank you. I'm glad it got you thinking, Anna. Oh, there it is. I knew I could see it. How can we apply lots and HOTS in a flipped classroom? Now, a flipped classroom is something I keep thinking about. It's one of these ideas that we're all throwing around and playing around with. It's as old as the hills, of course, for the older students. Humanities students, we've often had our classroom flipped. We read the books at home and we discussed them in class. When you're doing a flipped classroom, you want them to be acquiring new information at home and then applying and practicing in the class. We call this flipped because traditionally we present information in the class and they practice at home. And the idea is that the teacher should be on hand at the practice stage to help support the learning and correct before mistakes become ingrained. It's a very interesting idea. Yeah, I mean, I think as soon as any new knowledge is introduced, we automatically start going through the higher order learning skills. There is a danger, though, that with flipped classroom, that it becomes a very superficial understanding, and then when you get the kids into the class and they're practicing, you really have to start engaging them into the higher order, moving up through the pyramid. One of the worries I have about the flipped classroom is that I suspect that children who have a lot of support at home will be working much faster than the ones who don't have that support at home. And so the family context is going to start having quite a big impact in a flipped classroom. For the younger kids, for older kids in secondary, we're dealing with a different set of situations, and I think it becomes easier. The family impact will be less significant, but at primary, I think it's something we should bear in mind for the flipped classroom, the impact of the home environment. Okay. Cooperative work. It's a good way to work all the time. Cooperative work is great. You learn so many things in task work. Cooperative work is really good for when you throw it over to the kids and get them to discover things on their own. In the marshmallow experiment, this is cooperative work where they're really working together. No, don't do it like that. No, let me have a go. No, I think this is good. It's nice when you're doing cooperative work to have somebody observing and taking notes, to share the roles out, so that you have somebody who's taking the minutes, or who's going to be the portavoz, I can't think of that. My bilingualism is going at the moment, to be the spokesperson and relate back to the class what's happened. Somebody else in cooperative work is responsible for gathering the materials. Cooperative work works on so many different levels. It's a really fantastic way to deal with the learning process. Needs a very skilled teacher to manage it. So if you're doing that, many congratulations. Cooperative work is something I would like to see happening more really in the classroom. Thanks for that question. And I hope it has got you thinking about new ways to teach. Thank you very much for joining me today. No more questions? Oh, you love Benjamin's quote. There's something about Portugal there. Is it? It's a Portuguese name. Yes, I'm from Portugal. I'm glad you've joined us from Portugal. Okay. Okay, good afternoon and goodbye.